This meeting hosted by the Brighton and Hove Labour Left Alliance. Labour Left Alliance is an organisation, socialists, Marxists of various types, and left social democrats. And we have members and supporters, rather, inside the Labour Party and outside. We've got well over 2,300 supporters. We're part of the fight back, and so is this meeting. This meeting, Reinstate Socialism, Socialism Will Not Be Silenced, will last for 1.5 to 2 hours. And before I introduce the three speakers, I shall just say a couple of reasons why we're holding this meeting and why I'm delighted, very happy to be involved. My name is Dave Hill. I was 47 years in total in the Labour Party, and I resigned with the suspension of Jeremy Corbyn, resigned in horror at the rightward march of Starmer, the rightward march of Labour. But of course, you've been in the party for 5 decades, or in my case, since 1961, on and off, then we know there's a permanent struggle between left and right. And this meeting here is part of the left fight back within and indeed outside the Labour Party. Various constituency Labour parties are being threatened with suspension for passing resolutions in support of Jeremy Corbyn, calling for his reinstatement. South Thanet, for example, calls the suspension an unjustified outrage. And David Evans, the Secretary General of the General Secretary of the Labour Party, is saying that we are not, it is not competent business. Well, I'm going to speak in very chairman-like, careful terms. Sod off, David Evans. All it means, not competent business, is that you will not consider it competent to consider. But for the rest of us, perhaps 100,000, perhaps even 200,000 socialists within the Labour Party, we feel we are most certainly competent to discuss this business and what, to repeat, what South Thanet called an unjustified outrage. I think that's enough from me. There is a model resolution supporting Corbyn on the National Labour Left Alliance website. So I will now tell you about the three speakers. First speaker is Tony Greenstein, who's a newcomer to politics. That's a joke. He's the first Jewish Labour Party member to be suspended following Jeremy Corbyn's election as leader. Greg Hadfield, who is repeatedly suspended, and he was a formerly elected secretary of Brighton District Labour Party. And the final speaker is Chris Williamson, who was one of the best of the socialist MPs within the Labour Party. And he was also suspended for speaking out on the issue of Jeremy Corbyn and on the issue of anti-Semitism and the International Holocaust, the IHRA definition, etc. Okay, Tony will have about 10 minutes, Greg will have about 10 minutes, and Chris will have about 15 minutes. And then it's open to you, brothers and sisters, who have joined this meeting. Thank you for joining. Over to you, Tony.
Right, well, thank you, comrades, and thank you, Dave. This meeting is taking place at a very crucial time in many ways for the left in the Labour Party, because we have a leader, Keir Starmer, who is quite determined to purge the Labour Party of all traces of what can be called Corbynism. And the shock that many people experienced with Corbyn's suspension should not have come as a surprise to people. And if I can just show you on the screen what I mean. I hope it doesn't go completely blank, because he says, can everyone see anything? Because it's no.
It was a blank screen.
I'll try it again. and hopefully it will work better this time.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, it says 3 months ago. 3 months ago, this tweet appeared from Adam Kaler of the Jewish Telegraph, saying, according to a few Labour sources this morning, it is very possible and highly likely that Jeremy Corbyn will have the whip removed very soon as a result of the recommendations in the HRC report. And I'll stop sharing now. And that was reported by Canary. Anyone who thinks that the suspension of Corbyn was a result of his statement last week on receipt of the HRC report is quite simply living in cloud cookie land. The decision to suspend Corbyn, I believe, and I think it's clearly provable from the tweet and the reports 3 months ago, the decision to suspend Corbyn as a result of the HRC report was taken regardless of whether Corbyn had said anything at all. I have no doubt if Corbyn had kept his mouth shut and said nothing, he would still have been suspended. And the problem is that throughout this whole affair, there has been a failure to appreciate where the anti-Semitism allegations came from. Let me give a very simple analogy, which I've used before, about anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, because this is a kind of ruling class narrative now, that it's taken for granted that the Labour Party is infested with anti-Semitism. And all I have to say about that is that imagine that you were to find a few paedophiles in the Labour Party, because with a party of over 500,000 people, then it's inevitable that there will be some people who are paedophiles. Would anyone say that the Labour Party is therefore overrun by paedophiles? Or say our job is to remove every single one, which of course is absurd because you wouldn't know who they are. Of course not. Every party will have some paedophiles in them. Every party will have people with anti-Semitic views. But the idea that the Labour Party is overrun by them or that it has a problem with them is quite simply a construct, a narrative that has no foundation in fact. If indeed the Labour Party was overrun by anti-Semitism or any form of racism, does anyone seriously believe that the tabloid press, the Daily Mail, which initiated this campaign, the Express, the Sun, etc., would be in the slightest bit concerned about it? On the contrary, if you look at the Tory party, for 10 years it was in alliance with anti-Semites and fascists in the European Parliament. Parties like the Law and Justice Party in Poland, or the LNNK, the Fatherland and Freedom Party in Latvia. The latter party, the Latvian party, was represented by Robert Zeil, who marched every year with the veterans of the Latvian Waffen-SS. But no one pulled up the Tory party because of that. And we learned only a few weeks ago that the Tory party in the European Council is allied with groups like the Swedish Democrats, many of whose members walk around openly with swastikas in Stockholm. So, I mean, this is not about anti-Semitism. It never was about anti-Semitism. That was a ruse, in a sense, to get rid of Corbyn. Because if you understand, when Corbyn was elected, someone who was anti-NATO, anti-war, and so on, there was no doubt shockwaves starting from Langley, Virginia, where the CIA is based, to the military headquarters of the Israeli army in Tel Aviv, via MI5 headquarters in London. Anyone who knows the history of US imperialism and the way it has destabilized political parties in Latin America should not be surprised at the shock that was felt when the second major party in Britain, the United States' closest ally, was seemingly taken over by anti-American elements. So, I mean, that is the origin of the anti-Semitism nonsense. No one can seriously maintain that the Labour Party or Jeremy Corbyn was anti-Semitic. But unfortunately, much of the left, including Jeremy Corbyn, went along with the anti-Semitism narrative. They went along with the idea that if you expel a few people, then you would cure the problem. And in fact, the leaked report showed that Corbyn's office and Corbyn personally had intervened with the governments and legal unit, the compliance unit in effect, in the Labour Party, to try and secure the removal of people like myself, Jackie Walker, Chris Williamson, and so on. And all I have to say, I mean, I campaigned, I've made many a speech over the last 4 or 5 years. And the one point I've made repeatedly is this. They didn't want people like Jackie Walker, people like Mark Wadsworth, myself, and then Chris Williamson. We were not the real target. We were collateral damage. The real target was Jeremy Corbyn and the left leadership of the Labour Party. And the tragedy of the last 5 years is that Corbyn himself and his office never understood what the purpose of this attack was. It came from the Board of Deputies. The Board of Deputies has a history of opposing any attempts to fight fascism, racism, and anti-Semitism. In 1936, the key battle of Cable Street against Sir Oswald Mosley's British Union of Fascists, the Board of Deputies told Jewish people to stay in their homes, keep their heads down, and everything would be fine. Thousands of Jewish workers ignored them, and they joined hands with non-Jewish workers and others, and they repelled Mosley's fascists. But the Board of Deputies was vigorously opposed to doing absolutely anything. And in the 1970s, they did exactly the same. They opposed any attempts to combat the National Front. Their main concern was the Anti-Nazi League was dominated by anti-Zionists. So the idea that the Board of Deputies was somehow concerned about anti-Semitism is a load of nonsense. And of course, that was why in 2018, they pressed for the adoption of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, because the IHRA defines anti-Semitism not as most people understand it, which is hostility, prejudice, or discrimination against Jews, which is the normal, common sense understanding of what anti-Semitism is. But they redefined it in terms of hostility to the Israeli state and Zionism. So if you oppose what Israel is doing at this very moment, which is demolishing houses and homes in East Jerusalem and the West Bank, making hundreds of people homeless, you are anti-Semitic. So the Palestinians, for opposing their oppression, for opposing the racist nature of the Israeli state, are defined by the IHRA as anti-Semites. That is an absolute absurdity. It's like saying that those who opposed apartheid in South Africa were motivated by hostility and racism towards white people. No one would have bought that, least of all Jeremy Corbyn. But unfortunately, people did buy into it when it came to anti-Semitism. And let's be quite clear, what does this anti-Semitism mean in terms of how the Zionists define it? 50, 80 years ago, the majority of Jewish people in this country were working class. They lived in the East End. And therefore, they actually knew what anti-Semitism was. I mean, for example, my own father, I've often given this as an example, he was one of those who took part in the Battle of Cable Street. Did he need a definition of anti-Semitism to understand what anti-Semitism was? No, of course not. If you went right down the wrong road in the East End, he got his head kicked in. That was what anti-Semitism was. Anti-Semitism is not a difficult concept. But of course, if you want to redefine it in terms of Israel, then of course you need a 500-word definition, which is what the IHRA is, in order to shoehorn anti-Semitism into what is anti-Zionism. We maintain a very strict demarcation between hostility to Jews, anti-Semitism, and hostility to Zionism, which is anti-racism. And that is something that the Zionists have never been able to take on board. And it's something, unfortunately, that Jeremy Corbyn also did not understand, where these allegations were coming from. But we, I think, have to be quite clear. There never was an infestation of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. It was a narrative run by the popular press from the Sun to the Guardian, and it's as untrue now as it was yesterday. Keir Starmer, the left made a great number of mistakes in thinking that Keir Starmer was going to run with Corbyn's manifesto, when it was quite clear that Starmer was standing in order to eradicate any trace of the left inside the Labour Party. And I believe that this witch hunt that we are seeing now, and it is a witch hunt, hundreds of people have been suspended and expelled, is about purging the Labour Party. And therefore it's absurd when groups like Momentum and the campaign group, what is their response to the suspension of Jeremy Corbyn? They say it undermines the fight against anti-Semitism. It's politicizing the fight against anti-Semitism. This is so absurd, it barely needs commenting upon. The whole anti-Semitism weapon was fashioned in order to get rid of Corbyn. To still subscribe to it is actually subscribing to the removal and suspension of Corbyn himself. You're trying to say that the weapon they have devised to attack the left is somehow something we can all gather around and adopt. Unfortunately, although in Momentum, John Lansman's acolytes were removed in an election earlier this year, the people have replaced them. Momentum Forward are politically no different from those who were in office before them. I have to say, apart from Chris Williamson's resistance group, apart from the Labour Left Alliance, locally and nationally, there are no sections of the left now who are willing to stand up and say, we do not accept the narrative that you put forward, that anti-Semitism was rife when Jeremy Corbyn was elected, and when apparently the hundreds of thousands of people who joined the Labour Party were also overwhelmed or infiltrated with anti-Semitism. I have no doubt that Keir Starmer, he did his best to ensure that the EHRC report was as damning as possible. And actually the EHRC report is pretty insubstantial. It finds 2 cases of people harassing other people, all of which are bogus because they define harassment as political speech. They never name any individual who was harassed, apart from maybe the person who fronted, who was on first on the Labour. If you remember the BBC Panorama programme, is Labour anti-Semitic? I don't know why they put the question mark there because they'd already reached a conclusion. But the first person who appeared was the former director of the Jewish Labour movement and an ex-employee of the Israeli embassy, Ella Rose. And anyone who remembers her performance would realise what a terrible injustice it was that she was not nominated for an Oscar, because it was a fine performance by her, but there was no truth in her allegations. And indeed, there was no substance throughout the programme, which was wholly dishonest. All the people who were allegedly victimised just happened to be officers of the Jewish Labour movement, which is an amazing coincidence. And we see in this anti-Semitism what is happening now. 25, 30 or more people who've been suspended are Jewish. And I have to ask, what kind of anti-Semitism campaign is it that targets Jewish people above all? Jackie Walker, myself, and many others now are in the firing line, not because we're anti-Semitic, but because we are anti-Zionist, because we have criticisms of Israel and the way it treats the indigenous population, the Palestinians. And so it's a campaign based on a big lie. And if you repeat a lie often enough, as Goebbels said, then it becomes an accepted truth. But for us, it is not true. It is newspeak and nothing more. I don't know what's going to happen to the Ford inquiry into the Labour leaked report. You remember that leaked report that Keir Starmer tried to bury. And in essence, he tried to bury the Ford report, although he gerrymandered the composition of that inquiry to remove Alf Dubs, who was a refugee from Nazi Germany. That is really what they're about. So we will see if the Ford inquiry today even reports, because I have a suspicion that it will be allowed to sink in silence, as it were. Now, what do we do? And I think what we do is not what the campaign group has done. The campaign group consists now of 36 people, and just half of the MPs, and I'm afraid it doesn't include our own MP, Lloyd Russell Boyle, have signed a petition in support of Jeremy Corbyn. And this is really outrageous. people have to get behind Corbyn, despite his many faults, and say his suspension is absolutely unacceptable. And if Starmer goes ahead with it, the campaign group, in my opinion, and this is only my opinion, needs to actually sit as socialist independents on the back benches and actually consider forming maybe a new party, because it's quite clear, in my opinion, the Labour Party is becoming irredeemable. That what happened, the shock of Corbyn's election, out of the blue, a 200-to-1 outsider at the beginning, the right is determined that that will never, ever happen again. They are determined to make the Labour Party safe for capitalism. And in that context, I think we have to reassess our own position. At the moment, I think it's important that the LLA and Chris Williamson's group and others maintain a position that people should be both inside the Labour Party and organise those who've left the Labour Party, as many people have. The worst thing we can do is to give up in demoralisation, because I have no doubt that Keir Starmer will fail in his project, even if he manages to expel most of the left. The chances of him becoming Prime Minister are actually quite remote, because there's nothing he can offer to the constituencies which used to be part of what was called the Red Wall. There are reasons for that.
Winding up, Tony.
Yep, okay, I shall wind up and simply say that, well, I've got two things. Firstly, it is outrageous that whenever anyone mentions Israel or Zionism, they get expelled. When you have someone like, for example, Luke Akehurst, who's standing for the Labour NEC, who has openly proclaimed his support for Israeli snipers mowing down unarmed demonstrators in Gaza, including over 70 children. If someone supported the murder of Jewish children, they would be out of the Labour Party before you could whistle. And yet when it comes to Palestinians, their life is cheap. And if that is not racism, I don't know what is. And my final message really is, we need to go on the attack. We should not be defensive like Momentum and the campaign group. Attack is the best form of defense. We have nothing to hide. We have nothing to apologize for. Thank you very much, comrades.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Excellent. The next speaker, also from Brighton, is Greg Hadfield, who, as I said earlier, has been suspended, I think at least twice from the Labour Party, and was elected as secretary of the All Brighton District Labour Party until it was disbanded. Okay, over to you, Greg.
Thanks very much. 3 times, actually. I just want to begin with, first of all, saying thank you to the Labour Left Alliance for inviting me as an ordinary Labour Party member to take part in this panel. A panel of 3 speakers who are lifelong socialists, lifelong anti-racists, and who have managed not to get bullied into not taking part. I mean, it's shocking, really, that we have a meeting here that's about reinstating Jeremy Corbyn, allowing him due process, and freedom of speech so that we can speak about socialism. And yet I know every single member of the panel and those involved in promoting this meeting have been the target of shocking abuse, not just by the people who have no interest in the Labour Party, like Labour Against Anti-Semitism, but elected representatives like local councillors Dan Yates and former local councillors like Caroline Penn and Emma Daniel. I mean, it's shocking. But let me speak as someone who joined the Labour Party in 2006. I'm a fully paid up ordinary member of the Labour Party who's been suspended under 3 different Labour leaders. Actually, I joined when Tony Blair was still leader. Admittedly, he just announced he was standing down. But it shows that I hope that A, I have no illusions about the Labour Party being the only or the best vehicle for a socialist transformation of society, but that it has an important role as probably one of, well, the biggest, the most important political party in the world. And it's shocking to read the HRC report, which is a fantastically lightweight report, 100 and something pages. But if you read into it, please read it, because it's got some great messages. It says freedom of speech under the European Convention of Human Rights allows Labour Party members, especially elected representatives of the Labour Party, to say this: the level of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party has been overstated. It has been overstated not just for factional reasons within the Labour Party, but by people who do not have the interests of the Labour Party or the people it represents in their heart. So I joined the Labour Party in 2006, very naive. I joined to stop us bombing people in unlawful wars. Of course, in those, 14 years, that's proved a vain hope. But then I realized that Jeremy Corbyn gave real hope. He built a party with 500, nearly 600,000 people. But what he didn't do was reform the corrupt bureaucracy that has always been there in the Labour Party, hidden away. And like I say, I go back to pre-Twitter, pre-Facebook. But let's just begin with Lord McNichol. Lord McNichol, who doesn't get a mention at all in the EHRC report, even though a lot of the allegations that are now being made against ordinary members of the Labour Party refer back to events before and during Lord McNichol's occupancy of General Secretary. Doesn't get a mention. Doesn't get a mention about how he sat on the excellent recommendations of Chakrabarty report. I was actually suspended shortly after the Chakrabarty report, and foolishly, I just thought, there are allegations against you. You find out what they are. You find out who's made the complaints. You get a swift hearing, and it's fair to both the complainant and the target. Sir Keir Starmer seems to think that that's still the case, that the reason David Evans had to write to Jeremy Corbyn was the letter would set out the allegations against him. I mean, fat chance of that. It took more than 2 years for some of the allegations against me to be spelled out to me. On the one occasion I had a hearing. First time, the allegation that I never knew about, didn't even get a hearing. I was found not guilty without any hearing, but I was warned not to do it again, whatever it was. Second time, I was accused of anti-Semitism. Primarily, I was accused of anti-Semitism. Why? Because of one tweet where I said, the state of Israel is a racist endeavor and always has been. Took 2 years before I got to a hearing where it was thrown out immediately. The idea, even within the deeply flawed IHRA definition, it is, never mind Section 10 of European Convention of Human Rights, it is not anti-Semitic to say that. And it's the freedom and right of all of us who support the Palestinian struggle to say that repeatedly, loudly. So why is it brought? Why is that allegation brought? Yeah, and not just brought once, but 3.5 months ago, the same allegation was the primary allegation, the reason I was suspended. They even used this tweet of the same words. I had to explain at length in a document that I had to provide within 2 weeks, and I've never heard back from the Labour Party. And yet Sir Keir Starmer said his independent process meant that he would get a report on his desk every week to make sure these things are dealt with. Meanwhile, never mind Jeremy Corbyn. Yes, reinstate Jeremy Corbyn, but reinstate every other person suspended because of false allegations against them for alleged quotes, close quotes, anti-Semitism, but basically socialism, basically support for the Palestinian people, basically for upsetting the establishment that has remained in the bureaucracy of the Labour Party. So I was delighted the EHRC report said, we have every right to say these things. We have every right to say it is overstating the level of anti-Semitism for factional reasons. And yet, It is entirely possible for a Labour Party member to be suspended, expelled for speaking on a Zoom meeting with Chris Williamson. It is entirely possible for the former leader of the Labour Party to be expelled for saying something that the EHRC report specifically says he has a right to say. Now, why is this happening? Because they want to silence people who support socialism, who support the Palestinian people. They want to silence people who want to rock the boat. I find it amusing that Tom Watson is now on some reality show about don't rock the boat. Yeah. I mean, what's wrong with these former Blairite politicians who immediately go onto TV reality shows? Is that the best way they want us to get socialism? Absolutely not. Now, what's really annoying is the fact that we're not allowed to discuss this. You know, quite rightly, David Evans says CLPs are not allowed to discuss Jeremy Corbyn's reinstatement or the disciplinary process because they've always said it. For countless socialists suspended on fake allegations of anti-Semitism, CLPs for the last 2, 3, 4 years have been forbidden from discussing such fake allegations. I remember in April 2016, a motion to Brighton and Hove District Labour Party where I said it was ludicrous for Tony Greenstein to be accused of anti-Semitism. But I had to remove the name Tony Greenstein. But what we all agreed, it was overwhelmingly passed, was there had to be a swift dealing with such allegation. Who made it? What were the grounds for it? Let's see the evidence, let's have hearing, let's have natural justice. Of course, we now know the answer why that isn't the case. We've all read the Ford inquiry report. Even the HRC people have read the Ford inquiry report, they say, and taken appropriate notice. But this report that was launched, a swift inquiry to be published in mid-July, we sit here in approaching mid-November and it may be published before the end of the year. Anyone who reads that report can see the hard evidence of what many of us suspended, knew what was going on within the corrupt bureaucracy of Lord McNichol's regime. Now, Jenny did her best. Jenny Formby did her best. Jeremy Corbyn probably did his best. You can't imagine what it's like. But what it does prove is that the Labour Party is an important organisation, but it's not the only organisation. Labour Left Alliance is the bridge between socialists outside of the Labour Party and socialists like me within the Labour Party. But what will they try and do? They will try and marginalise and expel anyone who stands up. And Jeremy Corbyn is held up there as a warning to others. And what's the response of many of our better comrades within the Labour Party? It's silence. Don't say anything. Just keep quiet. Something will be sorted out. Maybe Jeremy could come to a deal, you know, with Sir Keir. They could have a chat, etc. And everything will business as usual. Meanwhile, countless socialists, countless anti-racists are hung out to dry. Their reputations are destroyed. Their well-being is interfered with. And still we're asked to, well, do we say any more? Broad church, unity, no, a divided party never wins elections, etc. Yeah, do we? I don't know. All I do know is that in this McCarthyite environment, the answer is not to say stay silent. In this McCarthyite environment, under a leader whose favourite novel is Franz Kafka's The Trial. Starmer seems to think The Trial is a handbook. It's fiction, it's a warning. We have to take heed of the warnings. We have to stand up and say we believe in freedom of speech. We believe in freedom to organise. These are difficult times, but it puzzles me why Labour Party organisations across the country are not getting together on Zoom, by email, by WhatsApp, by whatever means, to say enough is enough. There are too many of us having our lives and our reputations shredded simply because we say this. One anti-Semite is too many in the Labour Party, but the level of anti-Semitism has been overstated. It has been overstated for factional reasons within the Labour Party, and specifically, it's been overstated as a weapon to beat Jeremy Corbyn out of politics, away from number 10, and to undercut his support for justice for the Palestinian people. All of that is connected. And when you see what happened, not just to Chris or me or Tony or Jeremy, but countless individuals in Brighton, often middle-aged women living by themselves, are put in fear of their reputation, in fear of looking at that Twitter or that Facebook, yeah, or of speaking at, if given the opportunity, at meetings. And who are these people who are the bullies, the abusers, the foul language that's gone on? We have 2 Labour councillors in Brighton and Hove, supporters of Peter Kyle, who are now facing a huge number of complaints about their foul language. We have the chair of Equalities who was accused of calling another female councillor a bitch. I mean, what sort of party have we become where the bureaucracy at the centre under the Starmer-Evans project tries to denude us of our values, of our freedom of speech, of our holding people to account, of due process, where if someone is accused of something serious, you know what the allegations are, you know who the complainant is, and you have trust that those complaints will be duly dealt with in swift order, in a fair way. Lord McNichol did none of that. None of that. If there's someone who should be suspended from the Labour Party, it's Lord McNichol, not his £300 a day just for not turning up at the House of Lords. We've got to learn how to introduce proper democracy within the Labour Party. That means justice, freedom of speech, and the right to argue for a socialist transformation of society. And the attempts to silence us are shocking. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Greg. Thanks very much. The final speaker, the star speaker indeed, although we're all equal, is Chris Williamson, former Labour MP, the MP who inspired so many of us in his travels up and down the country in defence of Corbynism and in defence, just as importantly, possibly more importantly, of socialism. And we're very thankful for you, Chris, for joining us tonight. We know you've been to Brighton to speak. Some of us have seen you speak in Brighton on a number of occasions. I'll use 2 words about you: indomitable and socialist. And that's what we need. Can't hear you. I can't hear you.
Chris is new to this.
You can be indomitable and socialist when you know how to switch your mic on.
Can you hear me now?
Oh yes.
Yeah, good.
Yes.
I don't know what went wrong there. I have been on. I have been on Zoom a few times. Can you still hear me?
Yes, it's fine.
Very
now.
good, very good, very good. Well, thank you very much indeed. Actually, it's probably a good thing that you couldn't hear me at that point in time. They were still muted because there's a load of fireworks going off. I don't know if that was sort of to welcome me to this virtual meeting in Brighton or what it was, but they were certainly celebrating outside anyway. So thanks very much indeed for being here. The last time I was actually in Brighton, as you may recall, that wasn't the last time thinking about, because I went to the Labour Party conference, didn't I? But when I was at that meeting, I think that Greg was speaking about a bit earlier on, or was it Tony? It might have even been you, Chair. I'm getting confused. We had to hold it outdoors, didn't we? But anyway, yeah, we managed to go ahead, and we weren't sort of deterred by the haters who were determined to try and stop us, and they were unable to do so because we showed that we were prepared to, and Greg, who organised it, to stand in solidarity, and that's really important. And one of the things which I think a lot of people in the Labour Party, the upper echelons of the Labour Party, have forgotten about. I mean, you mentioned, Chair, in your opening remarks, the motion that was passed by the Thanet Labour Party, and they referred to Jeremy's suspension as an unjust outrage. And they're absolutely right, of course, but there are many unjust outrages going back to Tony Greenstein, Ken Livingstone, Jackie Walker, Greg himself, Mark Wadsworth, and hundreds, possibly thousands of other grassroots members. And in some ways, those grassroots members who maybe haven't got a high profile, it's in a way even worse because they're kind of almost suffering in silence, as it were. They've had their reputations are trashed. And I know that some people, it's had a profound impact on their mental health. And indeed, it's had a profound impact on a number of people's ability to earn a living. People have literally lost their employment as a consequence of these foul, disgusting smears which have been perpetrated against people who are long-standing, lifelong anti-racists. It really is an absolute outrage. And, I've always said that democracy is important, or most important, when it's difficult, not just when it's easy. And for me, it isn't that difficult anyway, surely, is it, to show solidarity with people who are being falsely accused of being smeared and having their names dragged through the gutter? I mean, for being a socialist in this country, you're not going to get dragged through or dragged off the streets by a sort of a death squad. You're not going to get tortured. You're not going to get assassinated yet, anyway. And I just think we have to think about in other parts of the world where socialists literally are tortured and assassinated, and that isn't something that, thankfully, we have to encounter in this country. And so it shouldn't be that difficult, it seems to me, to express solidarity. And frankly, the lack of solidarity, particularly by MPs who call themselves socialist, is the main reason why we ended up in the predicament that we did, because not a single one of them lifted a finger for anybody, apart from myself, that is, to speak out against the witch hunt. And indeed, when I was myself suspended from the party, I got no support, no public support from the socialist campaign group. And I think all that did was to embolden those who were attacking us. And I made the point, and indeed in the week before I was actually suspended at a socialist campaign group meeting, that we have to draw a line in the sand. We have to start fighting back. It can't just be me. We've got to do this collectively, because in the end, it's not really about any of us. And I think Tony made this point in his comments. It's about toppling Jeremy Corbyn. It's about stopping this socialist project. It's about preventing an ethical foreign policy being put into place where we would be taking on the military industrial complex. We would be expressing formally solidarity with the Palestinian people. And that was unconscionable to so many people in the establishment, and regrettably so many people in the parliamentary Labour Party, who also had a particular reason to attack me, because I was, as you said, promoting the democratization of the party. And there's a certain irony, though, people who claim to be Democrats who seem to be opposed to themselves being subject to any kind of democratic accountability. So Greg said we need to go on the attack, and he's absolutely right. There's no point in us being in a political party, and particularly if you have a platform in a political party, to just be quiet. I mean, the idea surely of joining a political party is to try and make a difference, to try and bring about change, to try and tackle injustice. And there's plenty, as we know, of injustice in the country. And so it's important, therefore, that we do speak out and stand up together in solidarity, because when we stand together, that's when we are collectively strong. And if we keep quiet, if we allow these smears to stand as we have done for so long, then we're just going to be continued to be pushed back and not be able to make any kind of real significant impact in the way in which I think most of us would wish to do. And as I say, the reason why we joined a political party, joined the Labour Party, most of us, in the first place. And I think the mistake that was made, as well as not speaking up for individuals who were targeted, was to not actually defend the Labour Party's reputation. I mean, the leadership, the people around the leadership, obviously thought that the best tactic would be to try to appease these bad faith actors. And that was a disastrous strategy from start to finish. And, I railed against that and continually said this isn't the right tactic to pursue. But I was ignored. And indeed, on the day I was suspended, I made the point that the way in which the party had handled this and the way the leader's office had handled this had been really catastrophic. And the people I spoke to kind of acknowledged that they'd got it wrong, but said, well, we are where we are now, unfortunately, and we're in this situation. But they never really seemed to learn their lesson. They seem to continually double down on a failed strategy. But we know what the sort of extremist centrists, if you follow what I mean by that, are trying to do. I mean, essentially, they're neoliberals in reality. I mean, I see them as kind of right wingers, but they portray themselves as moderates and centrists. But what they try and do, and what the narrative of the media, corporate media, tries to do, is to portray the kind of far right and people, socialists, people on the left, as two sides of the same coin, really, both extremists, both with kind of foul, kind of racist views and views that that need to be sat upon, and that by trying to sort of put us into that same category sort of legitimizes the kind of attacks that we've been subjected to. And what is regrettable is that there are so many useful idiots in the Labour movement who have gone along with that and given those attacks against ourselves, has given it the kind of energy, has given it the oxygen that it requires to get stronger and grow bigger. And when you look at the half-hearted way in which the Socialist Campaign Group has lent its support to Jeremy, at least there is some support there. This is the first time the campaign group has done anything for anybody who's been targeted. But, for those of us that were saying all along that it's not about us, ultimately they're going to go for Jeremy. And, many of them still haven't signed that statement. Some of them indeed have put out statements actually criticizing Jeremy. And I'm reminded of the Pastor Niemöller poem, First They Came. And that is absolutely accurate, it seems to me. And ironically, people like John McDonnell are now being targeted and being accused. And indeed, the Zionist campaign against Zionist organization campaign against anti-Semitism has submitted a new hit list to the party of MPs that must be suspended from the party. It includes Barry Shearman. It's incredible. It's incredible how far they are prepared to go. But when you look at the EHRC report, I as you probably know, was named in the initial draft and mounted a legal challenge to that. And they backed off, and we continued to push them. And in the end, they removed any reference to me at all. And, Greg, and I think Tony as well, made it clear that it is a very thin document. And, if the party had stood up to it, and bearing in mind that the left was notionally in charge of the party when they mounted the investigation, when they started the investigation, instead of saying we're going to cooperate with this investigation, we should have challenged the very premise upon which they were basing the investigation in the first place. And frankly, if the party had stood up to the EHRC, they would have destroyed the whole basis for any negative report about the party in its entirety. As we know, they've only come up with only able to identify two cases. There were 6 originally, and thanks to the legal representations that I made, my name was removed. And I think as a consequence of those self-same representations, 3 other people, including myself, and then 4 people, including myself, were removed from it. But there was no challenge from the party, and that was a fatal error. Greg said that Jenny Formby did her best. Frankly, the Formby regime, in my opinion, was as bad as the McNichol regime. In many ways, she doubled down on not in many ways, she did. That regime did double down on the witch hunt. More people were suspended from the party, as far as I could tell, under her watch than under the previous administration of McNichol. So neither of them were of any use to the socialist project, it seems to me. And we should have been challenging the whole basis upon which they were mounting this inquiry into the Labour Party because it had no basis, it had no legs, and we should have defended the Labour Party's reputation as a party and its membership that's actually fought racism. And look at the party's record in terms of the equalities legislation that it's introduced, the anti-racist legislation that it's brought about, and the fact that many activists were, you know, the sort of backbone of the anti-Nazi League all those years ago in the 1970s. And, you know, before that, the Labour movement, Labour Party activists, very involved in the campaign against Oswald Mosley's fascists in the 1930s. And yet there was no real defence at all of the Labour Party's reputation. And I think that was a huge error. So as far as Jeremy's concerned, I mean, I just think it's unlikely that, I mean, I think it's absolutely right that a campaign is being mounted to demand his reinstatement. A campaign was mounted, not as high profile, obviously, as Jeremy's, to have me reinstated, and similar ones have been done for other people as well, and none of them have been successful as far as I can tell. I really can't see them, you know, Starmer and the regime, the bureaucracy now in the party's head office and the National Executive Committee backing down. So the question is, what are we going to do about it? I mean, I think it's right that the campaign is very focused on Jeremy's suspension now and calling for his reinstatement, but we need to be threatening something. And one of the things that I would like to see activists doing now is demanding that the trade unions defund and disaffiliate from the Labour Party, and particularly if they don't reinstate Jeremy Corbyn, because there needs to be some threat. Asking politely, asking forcefully for the party to see reason is just not going to work. We've tried that, and we've seen how the party responds, and we're in a worse situation now than we were, you know, before Jenny Formby stepped aside and this new regime took over, which is not, it's going to be even worse than the Formby regime. And that was pretty bad, to say the least. And I think we also need to be looking, and, you know, Tony mentioned this as well, about what are we going to do in relation to the Labour Party if we can't make that change? I mean, look, for me, I think the Labour Party is incapable of change now. And I think you know, the opportunity to you know, democratize the party, and the point that Greg was making in his closing remarks, I think in many ways that ship has sailed. I think the opportunity to get the Labour Party back on track has gone, and I can't see how we're ever going to get it back, because they're going to try and ensure that there is no way in which somebody like Jeremy Corbyn could ever come to the fore again, and no way in which a party membership will sort of have the desire and the sort of opportunity to push for the kind of change that all of us, I think, on this panel this evening want to see. A kind of modest socialist program. I'd like to have seen us going considerably further than we were planning in our manifesto, but we're not going to see a manifesto like that again. What we now have in this country are two parties that are essentially you know, two sides of that same neoliberal establishment coin. I mean, whoever wins the election, it won't really matter. The system will continue unhindered. And you know, if we are interested in change, if we are interested in making a difference, in improving the quality of life for people, then it's not going to happen with the Labour Party. I mean, there will just be tinkering at the edges. It will be neoliberalism, perhaps with a human face, but it will be neoliberalism all the same. Poverty will not be addressed. The housing crisis will not be addressed. Inequality will not be addressed. In fact, as we know, under the new Labour regime, 13 years, inequality got considerably worse. I know there's a lot talk about how the number of children that were lifted out of poverty, but actually inequality continued to go in an upward, exponential upward trajectory. And so I think the important thing is for us to be looking at extra parliamentary activity. Hopefully people are getting involved in the movement that I'm working with others to establish, but there are other groups as well out there. And that's where I think the pressure needs to be applied. And I think it's been a mistake of the Labour Party, really, down through the ages, to be focused almost exclusively. And this is one of the things that I hope would come to fruition much more in Jeremy's leadership, where we talked about building a social movement. but we need a social movement as well as an electoral strategy. An electoral strategy on its own is not going to work, because you'll end up with MPs like we've got now, and they'll end up losing their way and with no means of controlling them, and fall into disrepute and increase the level of cynicism about the ability of politics to change anything. And we know the establishment are quite happy with that, because that helps to keep the status quo in place. And so I think we've got to be, in my opinion, working to build a movement, to raise expectations, to raise political consciousness, to encourage people to demand change, to encourage people to recognize and realize the power that we have when we stand together in solidarity. The old chant about the workers united will never be defeated. If we can build that sort of thing, I think then we've got hope of actually making the kind of change that we all, I'm sure, want to bring about. And that in itself might lead to the point that Tony was touching on as he drew his comments to a close, about the possibility of maybe another party. I think that I am speaking now with key figures in the Labour movement about that possibility. I know it's not an easy path, and many people say it's a pointless path. It's impossible in a first past the post system. I don't think it's impossible. I know it's very, very difficult. But the choice is, we either go along with the kind of Starmer regime, we go along with the direction that the party is taking now, and we support Labour because we just support that team, we just support that colour, like a football team, like I've supported Derby County throughout my life, come thick or thin. Politics isn't a game. It's not a football club. It's about making a difference, it seems to me. And on that basis, I think we need to think very, very carefully about the future for the Labour Party, and particularly if they don't reinstate Jeremy. I think they'll slow time the suspension in any event, and ultimately push him out. I think if that happens, I think it's been the final straw for many, like you, Chair. When the suspension of Jeremy came along, many people have decided that that's the final straw. They've torn up the membership card and they've resigned. And I think if they do proceed with the expulsion, then I think that should be the final signal that we absolutely need to build something new. And while it might be difficult, it isn't impossible. It's been done before. Let's remember there was a duopoly in British politics before the Labour Party came on the scene 120 years ago. And, nothing's impossible when we stand together, comrades. So that would be my advice. Let's keep the pressure on the party to reinstate Jeremy, but let's be realistic and clear-eyed about the prospects for that. And let's be ready. And irrespective of whether they reinstate Jeremy or not, let's put our efforts into, even if we stay in the Labour Party, that extra parliamentary action and mobilising and inspiring those communities who have been passed over for far too long. And let's find a way of doing politics with people so that we can raise that political consciousness and raise those expectations to demand better and to build that better society that we all joined the Labour Party to try and create all those years ago whenever we joined.
Thanks for your history. Thanks for your activism. And the thanks, I won't say most of all, because without activism, analysis is no use. We're not armchair socialists. But so thanks for your history, thanks for your activism, but thank you for your analysis. As it happens, we are many different varieties of socialist and Marxist and social democrat at this meeting here tonight, but I happen to agree with every single word you said. I want to make 2 points. One, and I don't know what I'm doing wrong, but so far I haven't been trolled. So far I haven't had any negative, nasty emails or WhatsApp messages. But I know that a lot of comrades, including a lot of our women comrades, and Greg referred to this, have had a lot of personal nastiness, and it has affected them. And I just want to mention that some branches, some Labour Party branches, have formed WhatsApp groups separate from Labour Party membership or Labour Party executive committee in their branch. So some branches have formed socialist supporters groups, which include the existing leading activists in a branch, plus those who have left, because we mustn't, I mean, we're comrades, we're brothers and sisters. And so we give each other emotional, political, ideological, social support. And that's actually one of the main things that Labour Left Alliance does, brings us together inside the Labour Party and outside. Okay, now I'm pretty much going to hand over to Becky Massey now, and she's going to explain about how people are going to ask questions, make contributions. Can I ask that no contributions exceed an hour? Or to be more precise, limit yourselves to about 3 minutes, if you would please. And we'll end the meeting by inviting Tony and Greg and Chris to have a couple of minutes each at the end. Okay, so over now to Becky Massey.
Okay, good evening, everybody. Hopefully you can see at the bottom of your screen a raise hand button. If you want to join in the meeting, raise your hand and I can bring you into the meeting. Now, some people have already done that, and there are 1 or 2 questions in the chat. So I'm going to bring in Neil and Damien, but first I'm going to read out a question from Les Levido, which if the speakers can keep in their heads, that would be helpful. So the question from Les is, speakers have rightly said that what the Corbyn leadership should have done during 2018 to 19, but clearly it did the opposite, namely surrendering to its enemies and attacking its friends. The Labour Party's trade union affiliates colluded with this. Why? What fundamental weakness does this reflect? Does the Labour Party have any internal force capable of resisting the British state? So that's from Les, but now I'm going to bring in Neil. You can unmute Neil.
Can we spotlight Neil?
Can you hear that?
Yep.
Okay, good. Good evening, well, good morning, everyone. As comrades will remember from the What is Zionism meeting, I'm actually calling you from Australia, so I'm a little bit not exactly 100%, but thanks to COVID, I'm stuck here in Australia, but I was formerly active in Exeter constituency Labour Party, and I was quite successful actually in a number of ways. I got resolutions passed opposing the IHRA in definition. I also got a resolution to support Mark Wadsworth, and of course it was inevitable that I was myself going to become a victim of the witch hunt. But the point I wanted to make here is that actually I'm probably one of the few people who have been a victim of both the Kinnock witch hunt in 1980s and the most recent witch hunt. Now, I think actually we can learn a lot from the 1980s. I happen to be one of the Exeter 3. Some comrades may have memories that go back to that. And we were successful actually in obtaining a High Court injunction to block our expulsion. And I think that's the main point I want to make here. And I know Chris has been very active and successful in using courts, as has other comrades, including Tony. But our case, I think, from the 90s was a pretty important one, because it led to, along with several other cases in the 1980s, to actually the setting up of the NEC in the first place. Because prior to the NEC, the Labour Party system was completely, appalling. It was, there's no natural justice at all. In our case, the reason why the court supported our case, because the party had been both judge, jury, executioner, and policeman, and so on. And so our case was founded on the principles of natural justice, and so it is. I have recently tried to look through the law report to see whether it actually got into the case law. Unfortunately, it didn't, which I think is very unfortunate. But the essence of our case was this: that the Labour Party is an unincorporated association and members are entitled to natural justice by law. Now, as far as I'm concerned, the current witch hunt is driving a coach and horses through natural justice. I believe that it is unlawful in English common law, and that if a case could be put forward, I believe that it could be, dynamite. I mean, just to give you one case, famous case that was onto the in case law, 1986 Lewis versus Heifer. Sorry, 1978. This was the judge, and this was Lord Denning. I mean, Denning wasn't a popular figure in left circles in those days, but the fact was that this was a very, very important case. Unfortunately, it seems to have been forgotten by quite a few people. So that's my point. I think that I agree with a lot of people that it's probably now a hopeless case for the Labour Party. I in fact, I wasn't expelled. I was suspended. I resigned the day that Starmer was elected. So I just thought, well, who voted for this guy? There must have been a large number of people on the so-called left that voted for Starmer in the false belief that somehow he might, put forward a socialist agenda. But and it's quite, to me, it was quite obvious what was going to happen. And so, I certainly, support comrades who've decided to stay in and fight, and I think we should fight, obviously. But so I'd like to hear maybe from the panelists again about the possibility of going back to the courts. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I'm going to bring in Damien, then Stuart, then Adam. So Damien, can you unmute?
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, I'll be as pithy as I possibly can. I appreciate time is limited. So I agree with Tony and Chris and Greg that we need to go on the offensive here. And I think that battle can be fought both within the party. The reason it's so important that we go on the offensive is because we currently have the two major political parties in the UK who are engaged in a competition to drag the party to the right, to drag the country to the right, sorry. And by doing so, they are actually not just enabling, but accelerating the unchallenged rise of the far right. And we've seen in America where that goes, and we've got to prevent that happening in this country. The conversation this evening is focusing largely on how we on the left have been subjected to a psychological propaganda campaign. And if the proponents of that campaign weren't concerned about what we are capable of, I would argue they would not have engaged in that campaign against us. And I believe they have good reason to be concerned about anti-racist and anti-apartheid campaigners on the left of politics in Britain. An example of why they should be concerned is that, and I think we underestimate our own strength, in fact. We've been under the cosh for so long that it can have a demoralising effect on us, but I don't think it should have, because, for example, I was involved in the campaigns to force the resignation of Ian McNicol as the General Secretary of the Labour Party, and I was also an actor in the Resign Watson campaigns, which eventually ended up in Tom Watson resigning as the deputy leader of the Labour Party. So I am now going to be involving myself in organising a campaign to force the resignation of David Evans, the Blairite General Secretary of the party, and that campaign has a very solid and sound foundation in that Mr. Evans has unjustifiably suspended Jeremy Corbyn from the Labour Party. The final point that I wanted to make is that my only concern, I'm a Clause 1 socialist, and my only concern is the return of a socialist Labour government. And it's my view that Keir Starmer rendered himself unelectable by trying to overturn the largest democratic mandate in the history of British democracy. He tried to cheat 17.4 million Leave voters out of their referendum victory. And then, as if that wasn't bad enough and didn't make him unelectable anyway, he then compounded that error by shifting Labour right. Now, as we've seen from the results, general elections of the last 20 years, when Labour shifts right, as it did under Blair and Brown, the party lost 160 seats and 5 million votes and ended up virtually a rump party under Brown in 2010 with just 8.6 million votes. When Labour shifted left under Corbyn, we recorded 12.9 million votes and achieved the largest vote share increase since 1945 of 9.6%.
Okay.
So, in my view, sorry, can I just make my final point, if I may?
Yeah, make your final point. Yeah,
it's
thanks.
quite important. So my point is this: that by trying to overturn the referendum, we set ourselves against democracy and handed victory to the Tories at the last election. But the thing in our favour is that as socialists and anti-imperialists, if we were to make the argument that a Labour government, only a socialist Labour government, will implement an independent and ethical foreign policy, and therefore only under a socialist Labour government will the UK be an independent nation, sovereign nation, and thereby we can leverage back the 17.4 million votes that we lost and win a majority in Parliament.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thanks, Damien. I'm going to bring in Stuart Richardson next, and after that, sorry, I haven't got a name. I've got Global African Congress UK. So maybe you'll tell us your name when you come in. Thanks. So next is Stuart. So if we can unmute Stuart.
Well, he was there. I saw him.
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah, I'm Stuart Richardson. I'm an activist in Stop the War Coalition and treasurer of the Birmingham TUC, and we were very pleased to have Chris Williamson at the Birmingham TUC and quite a big attendance of 60 people while he was still an MP. I just want to make a short point about debating Zionists and then talk about what's happening in terms of resisting Jeremy Corbyn's expulsion in Birmingham. I do think it's very important to be well up, and I think Tony Greenstein's provided a lot of information on this, to debate in an intelligent and careful way Zionists by the nature of Palestine. And I always show people an article that I printed from the Jewish Chronicle, written by Jonathan Freeman, a columnist for The Guardian, a very strong supporter of Israel, in which he reports going to Israel and going to a Palestinian village and meets the mayor, and he gets 456 shekels a year for the Palestinian children. He goes down the road from a mainly Jewish town, and they get 1,600 for shekels per year. Now that inequality of 4 to 1 is probably greater than the inequality of expenditures of school education in apartheid South Africa between black and white children. It is a structurally, institutionally racist state, and that's how we should debate Zionists. We actually held a couple of quite well attended rallies in Birmingham with a broad spectrum, and Tony and people from the Jewish Voices for Labour spoke. And it was relatively successful. Unfortunately, today, obviously, given the difficulty, is with the almost total collapse of Momentum, who was a force which had 40 or 50 people. Some of the leading figures in Momentum seem to do nothing at all. One report in a left-wing constituency, they are discussing at the next meeting the suspension of Corbyn, but the ex-secretary of Momentum was very reluctant to have an emotion to sort of put them on the spot. And so there's very limited resistance. Just be very brief.
You're going to have to be, because you've had 3 minutes.
Talk about the future of the Labour Party. I think the only prospect of a serious split in the Labour Party, I think it's a possibility that they do come to power in 2024, but given the vast debts the governments are in, we'll be in a 1931 situation, having to attack the working class pretty viciously, and that could lead to some sort of split. I don't see any significant break taking place in the immediate period. So I think that, I mean, not in the Labour Party myself, I was expelled many years ago, but if people are in the Labour Party, I think it's a productive activity to fight in the Labour Party against the Jeremy Corbyn suspension. Thanks very much.
Nice to see you again, Stuart.
Okay, right, thanks.
Okay. I'm bringing in Global African Congress, followed by Adam and Christian. I hope the speakers are managing to sort of keep a note of anything they want to respond to in this. So here we go. If you can unmute.
Actually, whip down there quickly because it should be in 5 minutes.
Okay.
So thanks very much. I'll get you around next week sometime, okay? Oh, you're going to give me the I'm going to give them the money.
Stuart, can you mute yourself? Or disappear?
Can people hear me?
Right.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
We can now. Thank you very much.
It's all right. It wasn't Stuart's fault. The technology is beating all of us. Yes, my name is Glenroy Watson. I'm the secretary of the Global African Congress. In fact, I intended to just listen.
We can't hear very well.
Okay. Any better? Is that any better?
Oh, that's better.
Okay.
Yeah. Now I was going to say,
No, it's not better.
Not better. I wasn't going to say anything until Neil mentioned the people in wigs and gown, because I think, you know, when we're talking about fighting and being political and then looking at going towards the judges and court cases, it just seemed to me, and unfortunately, like Stuart, I'm not in the party, but I support the party and I support what Jeremy was trying to do. And people like me want to support those of you in the party who want to do something, but it needs to be politicized. It needs to be inside the party. It needs to be robust, because the fact of the matter is we've suffered a defeat, not just those of you in the party, but those of us outside who are supporting the idea of resistance and trying to get a global justification within the political stream. So Dave, I hope I haven't gone over the 3 minutes rule. I'm a train driver on the underground. I certainly don't want any red lights. But I think the struggle must be about how we can overturn the current situation in the party. I can't see it being a situation where we go to judges and whatever you outside. So, you know, if people can put up some kind of campaign standing against those people inside the party who are doing what they're doing and call on the rest of the public to join in, the party is very strongly supported, I think, still. Thanks for that.
Okay, thank you, comrade.
Okay. Adam. Adam, can you unmute?
Myself, yeah, and putting my video on. Okay, so yeah, I wanted to make a few interlinked points. I wanted to take issue with a few things that Tony said, and I also perhaps preface my remarks that pretty much everything I understand about this issue is due to Tony, because I read his blog very regularly, and I recommend everyone read Tony's blog. It really is the single best source of information about the witch hunt. But nonetheless, I slightly disagree with a couple of things that he said. Specifically, that Corbyn's suspension had nothing to do with his statement. I think that is just inaccurate, because what Corbyn did was that he broke an he broke a taboo by saying that anti-Semitism within the Labour Party has been exaggerated for political purposes. And it's important that we take note of that, because we need to not just support Jeremy Corbyn in the way that the Socialist Campaign Group are doing and Momentum are doing, but we need to support what he said and defend what he said. So I think that's an extremely important point to make. And then Tony said that it has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. Well, that hinges upon how we define anti-Semitism, and the whole purpose, the whole drive of the witch hunt has been to equate anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. So I think what we need to qualify that statement by saying it has nothing to do with anti-Semitism as traditionally understood. But of course, if you accept the equation, the conflation of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, then it has everything to do with anti-Semitism. And indeed, Jeremy Corbyn is an anti-Semite by that definition, because he believes Palestinians should have the same rights as Jewish people, which is anathema to Zionist ideology. So that's really the crux of that. So my third point is that I think we also need to reject this idea of British Jews. There's no such thing as British Jews whatsoever. There's no such thing as British Jews as a homogeneous group. They're extremely diverse. There's religious Jews who are largely, there's people who are culturally Jewish. There are Zionist Jews, and there are secular Jews, and there are anti-Zionist Jews. And these groups all have different interests and different priorities. And the likes of Keir Starmer are doing nothing other than catering to the Zionist lobby. They're not seeking to serve the interests of religious Jews, and they're not seeking to serve the interests of ordinary non-religious Jews who adhere to their cultural traditions nominally. And actually, the extent to which that is the case is exemplified by what Jeremy said, because the claim that the Labour Party, anti-Semitism within the Labour Party has been exaggerated for political purposes would be welcomed by non-political religious Jews who were formerly anxious that it had been exaggerated for political purposes. And this is a very strong line of argument that we're not making enough of right now. Okay, so have I made my point?
Okay, thanks for those points, Adam. Right, we've got two more contributions, and then so those are going to be from Christian and from Ian Christian. That's two different people, and then we're going to ask each of the speakers to wind up for about 3-4 minutes each. So back to Becky.
Okay, Christian, can you unmute?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Becky. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, and thanks, Chris. I agree with what Chris said. I think the reason, in some ways, Chris, it seems to me, was expelled for the same reason that Corbyn, just being essentially suspended for. Essentially, it's the same thing, just exactly the same thing. And I hope this time there's much more solidarity shown across the movement and so on. But I think Chris is also right about the need for a socialist alternative to Labour as well, because I think Keir Starmer, if he gets elected in 2024, and it's a big if, but if he does, imagine it, I think it'll be even worse ultimately on lots of levels than even Blair was, because Blair had the luxury of a good economic situation in general. He waged wars abroad, neoliberalism at home and so on, but he didn't actually have to go and attack the working class and implement kind of real serious austerity on workers. In fact, he could spend some money on the NHS and so on under his time. Whereas Starmer's going to inherit a massive economic crisis situation that we'll still be inheriting. And rather than actually really going for the rich, a Starmer government will be forced to really attack workers even more. impose austerity. We can see how he's already not supporting trade unions, you know, the NEU, you know, lecturers union or so on in their struggle right now to close the schools and so on. So given that there's a need for social alternative, my question was more, you know, given we've had left alternatives emerging in Europe, Syriza, Podemos, after the pacification of Greek social democracy, you saw the rise of Syriza. You've had Podemos in Spain. You know, what are the lessons to be learned, Chris, from new parties, though, that form themselves but still put elections and parliament first, fundamentally? And ultimately, when the experience of those governments, it seems to me, once they get into power, is they end up, unfortunately, implementing neoliberalism and not actually being a genuine alternative either. But thanks.
Thanks, Christian. So can I now bring in Ian, Christian? Ian, can you unmute yourself now, please?
Just done that, thank you. Two things. Firstly, just for information, I was at our monthly GC last week. Well, I was online for our monthly GC last week. And the chair, who is of the left, announced that she'd had an email from Region to say that anybody who questioned the EHRC report should be ejected from the meeting immediately.
Oh.
Yeah, not good. Secondly, my first reaction when Jeremy was suspended, I only joined the party in 2016 as a reaction to the chicken coop. But since then, I've been out on the doorstep. I've been out on the doorstep for Chris Williamson, among others, but mainly for Toby Perkins and our local council. We've got a good Labour council, but I need to keep putting them on the right track. And I can't do that if I'm in the Labour Party. So I would say to people who are in the Labour Party but object to what's happening at leadership level, think about local level, think about what's happening in your CLP. You know, we've now, I think we had about 30 people on the left who managed to get chair, secretary, treasurer, vice chair membership of our CLP. Whether it will happen again at the next AGM is another matter. But if I'm not there, that's one vote less. And I know of, you know, at least 4 people have already left the party because of it. So don't just think about what's happening on national level, think about what's happening on local level, and support your leftists in your branch, support them in your CLP. Thank you very much for listening.
Okay, thanks to everyone for their contributions. Now, in the same order as at the beginning of the meeting, we'll ask first Tony, then Greg, and then Chris to conclude, respond, make some points for about 3 minutes each, 3 or 4 minutes each.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I think the clear question that's been raised throughout virtually every contribution at this meeting is, where do we go from here? It's clear that Starmer is instituting what is in effect a police state within the Labour Party. So the ability of socialists to remain in it is open to question, to say the least. What I would say is that we need to rethink the way we've done things. I mean, historically, we've had 57 socialist sects, far left sects, which have considered, whose basis of operation has been that the differences between them are more important than the things that unite them. And I think it's incredibly essential that we think differently. We have to create a socialist movement, not necessarily a party, because I think that's premature, which can include socialists inside the Labour Party and socialists outside the Labour Party, that will include the Labour Left Alliance, Chris Williamson's resistance movement, and others who are genuinely interested in turning the tide, because I have no doubt that the Starmer project is going to be unsuccessful. And even if Starmer creeps into power because the Tories have become discredited, then he will become the Ramsay MacDonald of the 2020s. Of that, I have no doubt. So we really do need to think seriously about the way ahead, because small far left groups certainly are not the way ahead. If I can deal with some of the points, Damien mentioned Brexit. I think Brexit was symptomatic of the problems in the North. It was a demoralisation that dated back to the miners' strike and even beyond that, which has left people without employment, a deindustrialisation, poverty, and so on, a sense of powerlessness, which translates into blaming the other, in this case, migrant labour, Polish labour, and so on. I was opposed to Brexit, but I don't think that Brexit, the position on Brexit, the Labour Party, was the cause of the massive defeat that we saw last December. As regards Adam's point, yes, of course, Jeremy crossed a red line when he questioned the conclusions of the HRC report. But what I was saying is that even if he'd said nothing, he would still have been suspended. I have no doubt from the leaks from Starmer's office 3 months ago that that was what was in his mind. And Starmer is quite clear. I mean, he wants to get rid of Corbyn. I have no doubt he is going to be expelled. And the campaign group has to make up its mind what it's going to do. Is it going to simply sit there in silence? Is it going to make its peace with Starmer by capitulating on every single question? Or is it going to come out fighting? And so far, of course, the campaign group has done no fighting. It's kept its head down and it's sought the least path of resistance. As for momentum, well, it claims 25,000 members, but so far it's done absolutely nothing to mobilize them. As regards the question about anti-Semitism, I think we should be clear about anti-Semitism means hostility or hatred or discrimination or prejudice against Jews. That is what racism is. Racism is hatred and hostility to whatever group, defined group it is. It's nothing about hostility to the policies or politics of a particular state. You're not racist if you oppose the American war in Iraq. You're not anti-American. You're not anti-Chilean because you supported the people of Chile against General Pinochet. The idea that anti-Semitism could be redefined is a nonsense. It's a political conjuring trick. It's worthy of 1984. We should have nothing to do with it. Anti-Semitism is a very simple concept, and if you don't understand it, go and look it up in the Oxford English Dictionary. It's 6 words, and those 6 words are more than enough.
Time to start winding up.
Yes, of course. As far as the Jewish community, they call them Jewish stakeholders in the HRC report. I don't know whether that's a reference to Dracula or not, but as far as I'm concerned, there is no Jewish community. There are Jews in Britain. They live in different communities. There's an ultra-Orthodox community. There's a Reform community. There are Jews who are secular and are not very keen on Israel. As it happens, in the last survey, 31% of British Jews said they were not Zionists. So this destroys the myth that there's a unanimity in support of Israel in the Jewish community. As regards the Labour Party, all I can say that the Labour Party is dedicated to reforming capitalism. The problem is capitalism cannot be reformed. And now we can see with Starmer, he has adapted completely to the state, so much so that he even supports a bill in effect legalizing torture. That is how despicable the man is. We should have no truck with it, and we should be working together, regardless of what party or group we're members of. Thank you very much. This has been an excellent meeting.
Yeah, I agree.
Tony, well said.
Greg?
Thanks, Dave, and thanks, Tony. Just a first point about the Labour Party, because it's something very much on my mind. All I want to say is that in a just, fair, democratic Labour Party, no socialist, no anti-racist, no pro-Palestinian will ever be suspended or expelled. And if you are suspended or expelled for doing all that, then so be it. And if you're not suspended or expelled because you haven't done that, then shame on you. Do it. in the end, we won't have a choice. We'll either achieve something by changing, transforming the Labour Party into the sort of party we want, or we won't. But that won't stop our political activity. But one of the ways not to do it, Neil, I must say, I've been thinking about this, about legal action. Obviously, there's lots of talk about legal action. I don't actually believe in it. You know, the libel laws are laws for the rich and the famous. The rule book basically says the General Secretary can do whatever he, she thinks. The Labour Party routinely breaches the data protection legislation by not responding to subject access requests, not just within one calendar month, not within 3-month calendar months, but never, ever. And when our data is breached by leaks about individual members being suspended, and it's leaked to national and local media, nothing is ever done. Now, we can look at hugely expensive legal action, but I believe it won't get us anywhere. I'm interested by David Evans, because in the end, everything that gets done is the responsibility of the General Secretary. And therefore, we can argue the chief executive change, but our political activity should be against the democratic elected leadership of the party, the NEC, and it should be bottom up for the leader. I would just say about electoral success, we talk about electoral success as if it was an end. It's not even the starting line. We never got even to the starting line with Corbyn. And we've got to recognise that if we can't even get to the starting line, we're not really going to get anywhere about transforming society. I can't quite see why this is aligned with Stuart's comments about reductive, which I totally agree with, Stuart Richardson. But I seem to have made a note here about the Jewish community, which is just what Tony has said, basically. You read that EHRC report, and it just talks about stakeholders and the Jewish community. I mean, there are elements in it which seem blatantly anti-Semitic in speaking as if Jewish people are one voice, who have one interest, who act together all the time. There's kind of a double think, Adam, I think, about Starmer and his statement, because on the one hand, he's saying he doesn't get involved in disciplinary procedures. He said in the original press conference, and I kind of agree with Adam rather than Tony, that I think Corbyn, thankfully, caught him on the hop. Because in the press conference, he said, without knowing what Corbyn's statement was that anyone who says the level of anti-Semitism has been overstated or is in denial about it, and I think he also said, or speaks on the same platform as people, he certainly inferred that, there is no place in our party. He rode back on that because he realised his McCarthyite approach was exposed to what it is. I mean, it's just outrageous. We talk about Labour values, but Jesus, we cannot have this, that McCarthyism is part of our values. I totally see what Christian says about austerity and Starmer and what he's going to inherit.
This will have to be your last point.
It puts me on the position, I'll go back to the beginning, is it puts me on the position of why do I want to stay in the Labour Party? Not because I have illusions, not because I believe it can be the main or the only way to transforming society, but to help expose its inadequacies, expose the illusion that the Labour Party is the answer. It may be a part of the answer, it may be a small part of the answer, but it provides a platform of 500,000 people where we can argue for socialism if we're allowed, where we can argue in support of justice in the Middle East, in support of the Palestinians, in support of the values socialists treasure, if we're allowed to. And if we're allowed to, if we're not allowed to, fair enough. But at least we stand or fall, suspend or get expelled on the basis that we believe in freedom of speech, socialism, justice and due process. And that's what this meeting, excellent as I agreed, has been. And thanks very much for everyone who's dared to join us. And we fight on. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Greg. Final wind up. Perhaps I shouldn't use that phrase. The final contribution, Chris Williams.
No, thanks very much indeed. Let me perhaps go in reverse order and pick up on Ian's point first of all. And I think Ian's contribution really highlighted to me how much worse the witch hunt that we are confronted with today is than the one that people encountered in the 1980s. Freedom of speech is dead in the Labour Party, and we absolutely have to fight for it. And that's one of the reasons why Tony, myself, Mark Wadsworth and Jackie Walker have come together to try and sort of build a campaign, and we've organised a few meetings to discuss this. And we really need to build that up because freedom of speech is a precious thing, and we absolutely need to demand freedom of speech inside the Labour Party, for God's sake. And the fact that it doesn't exist in the Labour Party is another reason why, in my opinion, the best thing we can do, the kindest thing we can do, is kill the Labour Party and build a new vehicle. I also agree with Ian's points about thinking local. And I think this brings me back to the point I was making about raising political consciousness and raising political expectations, because there are many, many things that local authorities can and should indeed be doing now. And one of the reasons why I stepped down from the front bench in the early part of I think it was January 2018, was because I was demanding that, or suggesting anyway, that Labour groups could use Tory legislation, ironically, to embark on a massive council house building programme, but also on a redistributive council tax budget proposition, whereby we could ask the Labour groups, or any local authority for that matter, but it would only be Labour groups, none of them have done it, to demand that the rich people in each borough pay a considerable increase in their council tax to stop the Tory cuts, whilst at the same time freezing or even reducing the council tax for everybody else. And we've been through the numbers. It works better in some areas than others, but it is a model that could work in every single borough, I believe, in the country. Nobody's taken it up yet. There's no pressure being put on local authorities to do that. And what we need to do, through a process of political consciousness raising, through a process of raising expectations, is that we start making life awkward and difficult and uncomfortable for people, Labour councillors, so-called, who are in a position where all they're doing is managing the Tory cuts, what, better than or as good as the Tories. I mean, it's just ridiculous. What's the point of having that platform in those circumstances? So I very much agree with Ian's point about thinking local. And that's something I think that we should be doing and starting to encourage local groups, and through the resistance movement, when the lockdown, we can never get through this, is over, that we're encouraging people to start bringing pressure to bear in that way, by giving people that information. Knowledge is power, and we need to be imparting knowledge and not allowing people in those positions of influence to make a change, to make a difference, to get away with the bullshit excuses that they do. They can't do anything, our hands are tied, and it will be illegal and all that. All nonsense. It can be done, and we need to be pushing them to do that. Neil's point, and indeed our comrade from the Global African Congress, absolutely. I mean, I think in terms of the point you were making about legal challenge, and that's one of the reasons why I set up the Left Legal Fighting Fund with the costs that I won from the Labour Party to assist activists. And what we need to do, and this comes on to Damien's point about being a formidable foe, we need to demonstrate to these haters, to these smear merchants, to the Zionist lobby, to the neoliberals, to the anti-socialists, that when they come for us, we've got the resources to fight back, and we will fight back, and we will defend comrades who have been so despicably and unfairly attacked in the way in which they have. And I've mentioned this in my opening remarks, but I didn't say that, in terms of the mental health impact that it's had on people. I know at least one person who took an overdose because she was so distraught. She thought this was the end of her career if this was, publicized, that she was somehow a racist. Absolutely despicable behavior that is being meted out by the Labour Party of all parties, the party that's supposed to stand up for the underprivileged and the oppressed. And it is doing the oppressing, or at least the right wing who dominate the Labour Party now. The new Labour cuckoos, as Tony Benn used to talk to them, have taken over the Labour Party. And we have to be that formidable foe. And that's why we created the Left Legal Fighting Fund. That's why we're continuing to build it up. And a comrade in the Global African Congress said, look, maybe using the courts is, not necessarily a great idea. Look, the capitalist courts, I don't, would not wish to have to go there. But frankly, the comrade from the Global African Congress, sorry, I didn't catch the name, said, look, focus on, changing the party from within. It is impossible to do that. I mean, I was in the party for 44 years. There is no mechanisms for us to be able to do that. And so I think that we need to use the legal route, and we need to be, doing these extra parliamentary things, which I mentioned as well. Coming on to Stuart's point, and this also, I think, leads us into the comment that Christian was making as well in relation to austerity and potentially being faced with the 1931 situation and Starmer then imposing austerity. Austerity is a political choice, and there is no similarity at all to 1931, because we are now in Britain a fiat currency. We have our own sovereign currency, and the fiscal deficit is about the only deficit that doesn't really matter. We can generate the amount of money that we need. Money is no object, because it is only the Bank of England that is empowered to create pound sterling. If you've got a sophisticated photocopy, you can't create money. You'll get sent to prison if you do that. The only barrier to spending that money and that ability to create that money is if you spend above the capacity, the idle capacity, which is available in the economy. There's loads of idle spare capacity in the economy. So don't let them get away with any argument at all that, cuts are inevitable, austerity is inevitable. And what I would urge people to do is get a copy, if you can see it, of this book by Stephanie Kelton, The Deficit Myth. And she kind of goes through that, and look up modern monetary theory and read work by Bill Mitchell. But this book is brilliant, and it kind of explodes the whole myth about austerity and this notion that, we've got to raise taxpayers. We fund our public services through raising taxes. We don't. I mean, taxes aren't to fund our public services, and we need to be making that point very clear. And this is where I come back to this point about knowledge being power, raising political consciousness, and not letting politicians get away with this idea that, cuts are inevitable. There's no such thing as a magic money tree. Literally, the only deficit, as I say, that doesn't matter is the fiscal deficit. The deficits that count is the deficit in health, the deficit in inequality, the deficit on the climate crisis. These are things that really count, and we can do something about that. And I think the difference, coming on to Christian's point about the challenges facing like an insurgent party and where Syriza went wrong. Well, actually, Syriza did still have some aces up their sleeve, but they didn't choose to play, or at least way Cyprus, the prime minister, didn't. Yanis Varoufakis, I think, would have done, and I think he would have called their bluff. But the difference between Greece and Britain is, apart from the fact that it's let's remember, Britain is the 5th biggest economy in the world, and Greece is obviously a much smaller economy by comparison. But the main difference is they're effectively like a local authority, because they are not in charge of their own monetary system. They're in the euro. And so they do have to dance to the tune of the European Central Bank. And as Yanis says very eloquently, that Cyprus was effectively waterboarded into submission. The Troika actually did him over. The IMF, the European Central Bank, and the European Commission. We aren't faced with that. We aren't faced with that in Britain. So we can be an insurgent party. We've got the resources. We have our own sovereign currency. There is no impediment whatsoever to bringing about the reforms that we want to see, in terms of public services, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of tackling inequality. And what we should have been doing is much more progressive and radical, rather than simply saying we're going to eradicate street homelessness at the end of a Labour government, which Jeremy was saying. Absolutely laudable, absolutely the right thing to do, but it ain't far enough. What we should have been saying is we will eradicate poverty in the lifetime of a parliament in the 5th biggest economy in the world. And we have the resources to do it, comrades. Read this book by Stephanie Kelton. We need to arm ourselves with the information and the knowledge, and we need to then go out and proselytize for that, raise those expectations, raise up political consciousness, and let's demand better. Let's get on the street through street protests. Let's organize things like workers' cooperatives and the range of other things that we can do in the local community. And don't let local bloody councillors get away with saying there's nothing we can do, our hands are tied. It's bullshit. There's plenty of things that they can do, made possible by, ironically, Tory legislation. For God's sake, get off your backsides and start doing what you're elected to do. One final thing I would say, Chair, is this. that the two-party system in this country is not fit for purpose. It's not an option to simply say, vote for the red Tory rather than the blue Tory. Vote for the red neoliberal rather than the blue neoliberal. That just brings politics into disrepute. We've got to demand better than that. And surely, as activists, that's our job. That's what we should be doing. Not just going along with it and just accepting this crap that's been handed down to us from on high. If we stand together, comrades, anything is possible. So let's go out and change the world. That's me finished.
Very stirring, comrade. Very stirring. Thank you so much. Okay, I want to make 2 points. The first one is that the Labour Left Alliance actually has a weekly seminar presentation on the history of revolution. And I look at it every Thursday evening. Like this week was the Chartists. We've had the French Revolution, 1830s, the Levellers, the Diggers, etc., etc. So LLA nationally has a lot of things going on. And also to refer to Brighton and Hove LLA, which also welcomes comrades from throughout Sussex and the Globe, of course, for meetings like this. We also hold regular meetings like this. I want to end up by thanking the speakers and just as importantly, thanking all the 78 people, of whom 62 are still here, all the people who...
It's 80 people, actually.
Well, whatever. Thank you, 80 people. Shut up, Tony.
And there was Facebook and YouTube as well, I think.
Okay, thank you, yeah. So thank you, comrades, and we'll invite you all to the next meeting. Okay?
Yeah.
Thank you, good night.
Solidarity.
Absolutely.
Au revoir.
Cheers, comrades. Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye.
Yeah, good night, mate.